Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what happens when 100 men face 4,000 warriors who have just annihilated an entire British column hours earlier? When you're outnumbered 40 to 1, when your enemy is mounted on the greatest military victory in their history, when retreat means certain death and standing means probable death, what do you do? The answer came on January 22nd, 1879, at a small mission station in Natal, South Africa, called Rorke's Drift. This isn't a story about imperial glory or colonial righteousness. This is about men trapped in an impossible situation, making second-by-second decisions between bad options and worse ones, holding a perimeter that should have collapsed in the first hour. No fluff, no Hollywood heroics. Just the facts, the desperation, and the 12 hours that turned a supply depot into a slaughterhouse. If this story grips you, if you learned something you didn't know before, hit that like button and drop a comment. We are building something here, a place where history gets told without the sugar coating. Now let's go back to January 1879, to Southern Africa, where two armies are about to collide in the most lopsided battle you've never heard enough about. The British Empire in 1879 was the largest empire in human history. A quarter of the world's population lived under the Union Jack. From India to Canada, from Australia to the Caribbean, British soldiers enforced British law, British trade, and British ambitions. They had repeating rifles, artillery, telegraph lines, steamships, and an unshakable belief in their own superiority. They conquered the Ashanti, subdued the Maori, crushed the Sikh Empire. They were professionals. They were disciplined. They were, in their own minds, invincible. But in Southern Africa, they were about to learn a lesson in humility that would echo through military academies for the next century. Let's talk about the Zulu kingdom. By 1879, the Zulu weren't some scattered tribal groups waiting to be colonized. They were a centralized military state built by one of history's greatest military innovators, King Shaka Zulu, 50 years earlier. Shaka had transformed Zulu warfare from ceremonial skirmishing into total war. He introduced the short stabbing spear. The assegai replaced throwing spears with close combat weapons, created the famous bull horn formation where the center fixed the enemy while the horns encircled and destroyed them, and instituted brutal training regimens that produced warriors who could run 50 miles in a day. By the time of our story, Shaka had been dead for decades, assassinated by his own half-brothers, but his military system remained. The Zulu army wasn't a mob. It was organized into regiments called Amabutho, each with distinct shields, headdresses, and fighting traditions. These weren't part-time farmers who picked up spears when called. These were professional warriors, organized, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. The Zulu kingdom under King Setshwayo controlled much of what's now KwaZulu-Natal. Setshwayo was no primitive chief. He was a sophisticated political operator who understood the colonial threat perfectly. He tried diplomacy, tried treaties, tried everything to avoid war with the British. It didn't matter. The British High Commissioner for Southern Africa was a man named Sir Henry Bartle Frere. Frere had a problem. He wanted to create a federation of Southern African territories under British control. The independent Boer republics were one obstacle. The Zulu kingdom was another. Setshwayo's army, estimated at 35,000 warriors, was the largest organized military force in the region. Frere needed it destroyed, so he manufactured a crisis. In December 1878, Frere delivered an ultimatum to Setshwayo with demands designed to be impossible. Disband the Zulu army within 30 days, allow British residents in Zululand, accept a British resident to oversee Zulu affairs, and pay fines for various border incidents. The ultimatum was presented on December 11th. The deadline was January 10th, 1879. Setshwayo rejected it. He knew accepting meant the end of Zulu independence. War became inevitable. The British invasion force was commanded by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford. Chelmsford was confident, experienced, and fatally arrogant. He divided his force into 3 columns that would invade Zululand simultaneously, converging on the Zulu capital of Ulundi. The center column, the strongest, crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift on January 11, 1879. Rorke's Drift itself was nothing special. It was a mission station and trading post on the Natal side of the Buffalo River, named after James Rorke, an Irish trader who'd operated there until his death. By 1879, it consisted of a church, a storehouse, and a few other buildings. When Chelmsford's column crossed into Zululand, he left behind a small garrison at Rorke's Drift, just over 100 men, to guard the supplies and serve as a hospital for sick and wounded soldiers. The garrison commander was Major Henry Spalding. The actual defense would be organized by Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot, B Company. Keep those names in mind. Chard and Bromhead. They're about to become legends. Chelmsford pushed into Zululand with about 1,800 British soldiers and 1,000 native auxiliaries. On January 22nd, he made camp at the base of a distinctive hill called Isandlwana. Chelmsford didn't fortify the camp. He didn't form a defensive perimeter with the wagons, called a laager. He didn't believe the Zulu would attack in force. This was his first catastrophic mistake. The Zulu army, roughly 20,000 warriors, had been shadowing the British column for days. On the morning of January 22nd, while Chelmsford took half his force out on patrol chasing phantom Zulu sightings, the main Zulu force attacked Isandlwana. What happened? There was a massacre. The Zulu bullhorn formation enveloped the British position. Despite their rifles and artillery, despite their training, the British were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and Zulu tactical skill. Of the 1,800 men left at Isandlwana, nearly 1,400 were killed. The 24th Regiment was virtually annihilated. The Zulu captured 1,000 rifles and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was the worst defeat inflicted on a modern army by an indigenous force in colonial history. The Zulu didn't know it was their greatest victory. They knew they'd won, but they'd also lost 1,000 warriors, maybe more, to British firepower. The victory cost them. Now let me ask you something. If you just won the greatest victory in your nation's history, if you destroyed an entire British column, what would you do? Would you rest? Would you celebrate? Or would you push your advantage while the enemy was reeling? The Zulu Reserve Force, about 4,000 warriors who hadn't participated in the main assault at Isandlwana, had a different mission. They were ordered to cross the Buffalo River and raid into Natal to destroy the British supply depot at Rorke's Drift. These warriors, mainly from the Outnumbered, Isandlwana, and UD regiments, were burning to prove themselves. They missed the main battle. Now they had a chance for their own glory. They were led by Prince Dabulamanzi Kar Mpand, half-brother of King Setshwayo. Dabulamanzi was young, ambitious, and about to make a decision that would define his life. Setshwayo's orders had been clear: don't cross into Natal, don't give the British a justification for escalation. Dabulamanzi ignored those orders. He wanted victory. He wanted glory. He pointed his warriors toward Rorke's Drift. Let's go back to the mission station. It's approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, January 22nd, 1879. The men at Rorke's Drift have no idea what happened at Isandlwana. They're going about routine duties. Some are unloading supplies. Others are resting. The hospital contains about 35 sick and wounded men, most suffering from fever or minor injuries. Then 2 riders appear, galloping hard from the direction of Isandlwana. They're covered in dust, their horses lathered and exhausted. The riders are Lieutenant Adendorf and another survivor from Isandlwana. Their news is incomprehensible. The camp is destroyed. The army is annihilated. The Zulu are coming. Major Spalding had left Rorke's Drift earlier that day to fetch reinforcements from Help Makar, a small post 10 miles away. That left Lieutenant Chard, a 31-year-old Royal Engineer who'd been supervising the river crossing, as senior officer. Chard was at the river when the news arrived. He rushed back to the station. Lieutenant Bromhead, 33 years old, partially deaf, commanded B Company of the 24th Regiment. When Chard arrived, the two officers had to make an immediate decision. Run or fight? Let's understand what running meant. They had about 150 soldiers, 35 patients in the hospital, and perhaps 100 native auxiliaries from the native contingent. If they abandoned the post and tried to retreat the 10 miles to help Mekar with wounded men on rough roads, in the late afternoon with Zulu warriors who could run down a horse over distance, they'd be caught in the open and slaughtered. Every man knew this. Retreat meant death. But staying didn't look much better. The mission station wasn't a fort. It was two buildings, a church and a storehouse, separated by open ground. There were no walls, no defensive positions, nothing. How do you defend a hospital and a warehouse against 4,000 warriors? You build walls, and you build them fast. Chard took command. He ordered the men to start building a barricade using everything available. The men grabbed mealie bags, heavy sacks of corn weighing about 200 pounds each. They stacked bags between the buildings, creating a defensive perimeter roughly 30 yards by 40 yards. They overturned wagons and incorporated them into the wall. They used biscuit boxes, anything with weight and mass. The barricade was 4 to 5 feet high, just enough for a man to fire over while having some protection. They had perhaps 2 hours before the Zulu arrived. The native contingent, about 100 men commanded by Captain Stephenson and Lieutenant Henderson, were positioned on a rise called Oscarsburg Hill overlooking the station. These were indigenous auxiliaries, armed mostly with obsolete firearms and commanded by white officers. When they saw the Zulu army approaching, when they understood what was coming, they broke. They ran. Every single one of them abandoned the position. You can't entirely blame them. They weren't regular soldiers. They hadn't signed up to face 4,000 Zulu warriors in a battle they couldn't win. Their officers went with them. Chard and Bromhead were left with about 140 men of B Company, 24th Regiment, and some attached soldiers from other units. 140 men to hold a makeshift barricade against 4,000. The odds had just gotten dramatically worse. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the Zulu appeared. They came over the Oscarsburg Hill like a black wave, 4,000 warriors in full war regalia, carrying shields and assegais, singing war chants that echoed across the valley. The sound alone was terrifying, thousands of voices in rhythmic harmony, the sound of men who just destroyed an army and were hungry for more. The defenders watched them come. Some of the British soldiers had never seen combat. Others were veterans. All of them knew they were looking at their deaths walking toward them across the grass. Chard ordered every man to his position. Soldiers lined the barricade, spacing themselves to cover all approaches. They checked their rifles, Martini Henry single-shot breechloaders, powerful weapons with an effective range of several hundred yards. Each man had 70 rounds in his ammunition pouch. More ammunition was available in the storehouse, thousands of rounds stockpiled for the column. If they could maintain fire discipline, if they could reload fast enough, maybe they could hold. Maybe. The hospital was a problem. It was a long, single-story building with small windows and several rooms connected by internal doors. 35 patients were inside, men too sick or injured to fight. Several soldiers were assigned to defend the hospital, firing from the windows and protecting the patients. This split the defensive force. Chard had to defend both the perimeter and the building. The Zulu didn't waste time with negotiations. Around 4:45 p.m., they attacked. The first assault came from the south and west, 500 warriors sprinting toward the barricade in loose formation. The British opened fire at 200 yards. The Martini Henry rifles roared, heavy bullets tearing into the Zulu ranks. Warriors fell, tumbling forward, dead before they hit the ground. But the Zulu didn't stop. They never stopped. They closed to 100 yards, 50 yards. The British were firing as fast as they could work the breechloader, extract the spent cartridge, load a new round, aim, fire, maybe 4 or 5 shots per minute for a trained soldier. The Zulu were taking horrific casualties, but they kept coming. Some carried firearms captured at Isandlwana, old muskets and rifles, but most were armed with spears and shields. They reached the barricade in places, stabbing over the mealie bags with their assegais, trying to drag defenders over or pull the bags down. The British used bayonets, rifle butts, anything to keep them back, point-blank shooting, men firing into faces 3 feet away. The first assault broke against the barricade like a wave against rocks. The Zulu pulled back, leaving dozens of bodies heaped against the mealie bags, but they didn't retreat far. They regrouped and came again. This time they attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to stretch the defensive line. The British shifted men to threatened sections, rushing from position to position. Every man who fell meant a gap in the line. There were no reserves. If one section broke, the entire perimeter collapsed. The Zulu focused heavy pressure on the hospital. Warriors swarmed the building, trying to break through the doors and windows. The soldiers inside, maybe 8 or 9 men, fired through the windows until Zulu were too close, then used bayonets to fight them back. Some Zulu climbed onto the thatched roof, trying to break through from above. Defenders couldn't see them, couldn't shoot them, could only hear them moving on the roof directly overhead. The Zulu set fire to the roof. Smoke began filling the interior rooms. Inside the hospital, chaos. The building was divided into several small rooms connected by doorways. Patients lay on makeshift beds, men with fevers, dysentery, leg wounds. Some could walk, others couldn't move. The defenders inside, men like Private Henry Hook and Private John Williams, realized the building was becoming a death trap. Smoke filled the rooms. Flames spread across the thatched roof. Zulu warriors were trying to break through the doors and windows. They made a desperate decision: break through the internal walls and evacuate the patients room by room while holding off the Zulu. Hook and Williams used axes and rifle butts to smash through the brick walls separating the rooms. They'd clear one room, help patients through the hole to the next room, then hold the doorway against Zulu trying to break in. This happened room by room, wall by wall, while the building burned around them. Some patients couldn't be moved. Private Garrett Haynes was too sick to walk. So was Trooper Hunter. Warriors broke through and killed them with assegais. The defenders could hear the screams, could hear men dying in rooms they'd just abandoned, but they couldn't go back. They had to keep moving toward the back of the building, toward the barricade, toward the only hope of survival. Hook and Williams held doorways in hand-to-hand combat, bayonet against assegai, stabbing and shooting at shadows in the smoke-filled rooms. They dragged patients through holes in walls, passed them to other defenders, then turned back to hold the next room. This went on for hours. By the time they evacuated the last room, the entire front half of the hospital was in Zulu hands, flames roaring through the structure. They saved most of the patients, dragging them across the yard to the inner defensive perimeter. But the hospital was lost. The Zulu now occupied a burning building 20 yards from the main barricade, using it as cover to fire captured rifles at the defenders. Chard saw the hospital fall and knew the perimeter was too large. With fewer than 100 men still fighting, he couldn't hold the original line. He ordered a retreat to a smaller perimeter, an inner redoubt made of biscuit boxes in front of the storehouse. The men fell back in stages, some maintaining fire while others built the new wall, then switching roles. They abandoned half the original perimeter, including the burning hospital. Now they held a space roughly 20 yards square. The Zulu pressed the attack, sensing weakness. They surged forward, trying to overwhelm the falling back British before they could establish the new line. This was the crisis point. If the Zulu broke through during the retreat, it was over. Darkness fell around 6 p.m. The battle continued by firelight, flames from the burning hospital casting flickering shadows across the killing ground. The Zulu could be seen as silhouettes against the fire, masses of warriors surging forward, falling back, surging again. The British fired at shapes, at movements, at anything that came close to the barricade. The Martini Henry rifles overheated. Brass cartridges expanded in the hot breach and jammed. Soldiers had to use knives to pry out stuck cartridges, losing precious seconds while Zulu closed the distance. Some rifles became so hot they couldn't be held without burning hands. Ammunition was running low in places. Chad organized supply runs from the storehouse to the firing line, men sprinting across the open ground with boxes of cartridges, distributing them to soldiers whose pouches were empty. The Zulu kept attacking, wave after wave, hour after hour. They decharge the barricade, take devastating fire, fall back, regroup, and come again. The bodies piled up so high in some places that warriors used them as cover or as ramps to climb toward the defenders. The British bayoneted Zulu trying to scramble over the melee bags. They shot warriors at arm's length. They used rifle butts to smash heads and fists when there was no time to reload. Every man fought like his life depended on it, because it did. There was nowhere to run, no surrender, no mercy if the line broke. You fought or you died. Let's talk about the ammunition situation. The British had stockpiled thousands of rounds at Rorke's Drift. The storehouse contained crates of Martini Henry ammunition, enough to sustain heavy firing for hours. But getting ammunition to the men firing on the line was dangerous. The storehouse was behind the inner redoubt. Men had to leave the firing line, run to the storehouse, grab boxes, and run back under fire. Assistant Commissary James Dalton, a civilian supply officer, took charge of ammunition distribution. Dalton moved constantly through the defensive position, bringing cartridges to sections running low, coordinating the defense, acting like a senior NCO despite having no military rank. He was shot through the shoulder during one supply run, a bullet smashing through flesh and bone, but he refused evacuation. He kept working, organizing ammunition, encouraging men, bleeding from his wound. The Zulu attacks continued until midnight, then began to slacken. The warriors had been fighting for 7 hours straight after marching and fighting at Isandlwana earlier in the day. They were exhausted. Their casualties were staggering. Hundreds of dead and wounded lay scattered in front of the barricade and around the smoldering hospital ruins. But they didn't withdraw. They pulled back to cover, maintaining pressure with rifle fire through the night. The British couldn't rest. They didn't know if the Zulu would attack again. They maintained their positions, staring into darkness, listening to the sounds of wounded men crying out in the grass beyond the barricade. Some were British soldiers who'd been dragged away during the fighting. Others were Zulu. All of them were dying slowly through the night. The defenders couldn't help them. Moving outside the perimeter meant death. The night stretched on. Soldiers fought exhaustion, adrenaline crash, thirst. Some men had been fighting for 8 hours without water, hands blackened with powder residue, ears ringing from rifle fire. They shook spent cartridge cases from around their feet, piles of brass glinting in the firelight. The mealie bag walls were shredded by bullets and assegai thrusts. Bodies were everywhere, Zulu corpses sprawled in grotesque positions, some still clutching their weapons. The smell was overwhelming, blood and gunpowder and burning thatch and human waste. This is what battle actually smells like. Around 4 a.m., the Zulu began to withdraw, not a panicked retreat, but an organized withdrawal. They'd had enough. They'd lost too many men for nothing, hundreds dead for a storehouse and a hospital they didn't need. Prince Dabulamanzi ordered the retreat. The warriors filed away into the darkness, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead. By dawn on January 23rd, the firing had stopped. The defenders waited, watching the hills, expecting another attack at first light. It didn't come. The Zulu were gone. As the sun rose, the full horror became visible, bodies everywhere. The British counted over 350 Zulu dead in the immediate vicinity of the barricade. More bodies littered the approaches, the hillside, the area around the hospital ruins. The actual Zulu death toll was likely much higher. Wounded warriors had been carried away during the withdrawal. Dead had been removed during lulls in the fighting. Estimates range from 500 to over 1,000 Zulu casualties. The British had lost 17 men killed and 15 wounded, 17 dead out of about 150 defenders. In a 12-hour battle against 4,000 warriors, in a position that should have been overrun in the first assault. How did 140 men hold against those odds? Let's break it down. First, firepower. The Martini Henry rifle was a devastating weapon. It fired a heavy .45 caliber bullet that could drop a man at 500 yards. In trained hands, a soldier could fire maybe 4 or 5 aimed shots per minute. Against warriors armed primarily with spears, that firepower created a killing zone that was almost impossible to cross without massive casualties. Second, the fortifications. Those mealie bags and biscuit boxes, hastily stacked in 2 hours, created a physical barrier that disrupted Zulu attacks. The warriors couldn't simply sprint through. They had to climb over or tear down the barrier while under fire. That slowed them down, created choke points, allowed concentrated fire on breakthrough attempts. Third, discipline. The British soldiers were professional troops trained to operate under stress. They maintained fire discipline, followed orders, supported each other. When sections were overrun, men didn't panic. They fell back to the next line, reformed, continued fighting. Compare that to what would happen if you put 100 untrained civilians in the same position. It would have collapsed in minutes. Fourth, leadership. Chard and Bromhead made good tactical decisions under extreme pressure. The decision to contract the perimeter when the hospital fell saved the position. If they'd tried to hold the original line with reduced numbers, they would have been overwhelmed. Pulling back to a defensible redoubt concentrated their firepower and shortened their line. Fifth, ammunition. They had enough cartridges to sustain heavy fire for the entire battle. If they'd run out of ammunition halfway through, it's over. The Zulu walk through and massacre everyone. Sixth, and this is critical, the Zulu tactical limitations. The Zulu were incredibly brave, disciplined warriors, but they were armed with weapons designed for a different kind of warfare. The assegai was a close combat weapon. It required getting within arm's reach. Against rifle fire, crossing open ground to reach stabbing distance meant taking horrific casualties. The Zulu had captured rifles at Isandlwana, maybe 1,000 rifles, but most warriors at Rorke's Drift didn't have firearms. Those who did often didn't have training or enough ammunition. They fired from cover, but couldn't generate the volume of accurate fire needed to suppress the defenders. Seventh, the Zulu had already fought a major battle that day. The warriors who attacked Rorke's Drift were the reserve force, fresh compared to those who fought at Isandlwana, but they'd been marching and skirmishing. They weren't at full strength. They'd also seen their comrades killed by rifle fire earlier in the day. Attacking a fortified position bristling with rifles after watching what happened at Isandlwana took incredible courage, but courage doesn't stop bullets. Finally, desperation. The British knew there was no escape. Surrender wasn't an option. The Zulu didn't take prisoners in this kind of fight. Every man fought with the knowledge that losing meant death. That focuses the mind wonderfully. Now let's talk about what happened next. On January 23rd, the defenders prepared for another attack. They strengthened the barricades, redistributed ammunition, tended to the wounded. They expected the Zulu to return with reinforcements. Around 7 a.m., soldiers spotted movement on the hills, a large force approaching. Hearts sank. They were going to have to do this all over again. Then someone recognized the uniforms. It was Lord Chelmsford's column, what remained of it, returning from Isandlwana. Chelmsford had spent the previous night in the ruins of his camp, surrounded by the bodies of 1,400 dead soldiers. He'd had no idea that Rorke's Drift was even under attack until he marched toward the station and saw the smoke. When Chelmsford arrived and saw the defensive position still held, saw the piles of Zulu dead, saw 100 exhausted men who'd survived the impossible, he was stunned. His army had just suffered the worst defeat in British colonial history. These men had won the most unlikely victory. Chelmsford's arrival ended the immediate threat. The Zulu weren't going to attack a full British column, but the war wasn't over. Rorke's Drift had been a sideshow, a raid that failed. The main Zulu army was still intact, still dangerous, and the British invasion had been thrown back with catastrophic losses. The defense of Rorke's Drift became a propaganda victory the British desperately needed. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to defenders of Rorke's Drift. the most ever awarded for a single action. Chard and Bromhead both received the VC. So did Private Hook, Private Williams, Surgeon Reynolds, who treated wounded under fire, Corporal Allen and Private Hitch, who held sections of the barricade despite wounds, and several others. The awards were deserved. These men had done something extraordinary, but let's not romanticize it. This wasn't a clash of civilizations or a validation of imperial destiny. This was 140 terrified men trapped in a situation they didn't choose, fighting for their lives against an enemy they didn't understand, in a war that was fundamentally unjust. The British had invaded Zululand. They started this war. The Zulu were defending their land, their kingdom, their independence. Cetshwayo had tried to avoid war. Freya had forced it. The warriors who died at Rorke's Drift were fighting for their homes. That doesn't make the British soldiers villains. They didn't start the war. They were following orders, doing their duty. When trapped and facing annihilation, they fought with incredible courage. But the broader context matters. This was British imperial aggression against an independent kingdom. The victory at Rorke's Drift didn't change that. The Anglo-Zulu War continued for 6 more months. The British reorganized, brought in reinforcements, and invaded again with overwhelming force. On July 4, 1879, they defeated the main Zulu army at the Battle of Ulundi. Chelmsford personally led the attack, desperate to redeem his reputation after Isandlwana. The British formed a massive square, artillery and rifles on all sides, and annihilated wave after wave of Zulu attacks. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Zulu kingdom was broken. Cetshwayo was captured and exiled. His kingdom was divided into 13 chiefdoms, deliberately weakened to prevent future resistance. Zululand was eventually annexed by Britain and became part of Natal. The Zulu military system was dismantled. The regiments were disbanded. The warriors who'd terrified colonial armies, who destroyed a British column at Isandlwana, who'd nearly overrun Rorke's Drift, were reduced to laborers in a colonial economy. As for Prince Dabulamanzi, the man who ordered the attack on Rorke's Drift against his king's orders, he survived the war but lived in disgrace. His unauthorized raid had cost hundreds of Zulu lives for no strategic gain. It gave the British a propaganda victory when they desperately needed one. Cetshwayo never forgave him. The defenders of Rorke's Drift became legends. Chard and Bromhead were promoted and feted as heroes. They toured Britain, gave speeches, lived off their fame, but the actual experience of Rorke's Drift haunted many of the survivors. Private Hook, who'd saved multiple patients from the burning hospital while fighting hand-to-hand with Zulu warriors in smoke-filled rooms, received the Victoria Cross and lived until 1905. He rarely spoke about the battle. The memories were too raw. Commissary Dalton, who'd organized the ammunition distribution despite being shot through the shoulder, received the Victoria Cross but died of illness just a few years later, his health never recovering from the wound. Surgeon Reynolds continued his military career, serving in multiple campaigns, but Rorke's Drift remained the defining moment of his life. Many of the common soldiers faded into obscurity after their brief moment of fame, their heroism forgotten by a public that moved on to the next imperial adventure. Let's talk about the broader implications. Rorke's Drift became a cornerstone of British military mythology, a story of British courage and determination against impossible odds. It's been depicted in books, films, most famously the 1964 movie Zulu starring Michael Caine. The film is entertaining but historically problematic. It portrays the Zulu as a faceless horde, omits the imperial context, and creates dramatic scenes that never happened. But it cemented Rorke's Drift in popular imagination as the ultimate underdog victory. Here's what the mythology obscures. The Zulu fought with incredible bravery at Rorke's Drift. They attacked a fortified position defended by soldiers with superior firepower, knowing they'd take horrific casualties because their military culture demanded it. They could have bypassed Rorke's Drift entirely. It wasn't strategically important. They attacked because Prince Dabulamanzi wanted glory, and because warriors who'd missed the main battle at Isandlwana wanted to prove themselves. That decision cost them hundreds of lives. The British celebrated Rorke's drift because they desperately needed a victory after Isandlwana. The same day the British lost 1,400 men in a catastrophic defeat, 140 men held an impossible position. That contrast was too perfect for propaganda. Rorke's drift became the story, Isandlwana became a footnote. But here's the thing, both battles demonstrated the same truth. The Zulu were a formidable military force capable of defeating British regulars in open combat. Isandlwana proved that. The British technological advantage, specifically firepower, could prevail if properly deployed from defensive positions. Rorke's drift proved that. The war itself was an exercise in imperial aggression dressed up as necessary intervention. Freer wanted to destroy the Zulu kingdom to eliminate a potential threat to British expansion. He got his war, the British won, and what did it accomplish? The Zulu kingdom was destroyed, yes, but the British gained a territory they didn't need and couldn't effectively administer, at the cost of thousands of lives, British and Zulu, and enormous expense. Within a few years, the British handed Zululand over to Natal, then to the Union of South Africa. The great kingdom that had terrified colonial powers became a backwater, its people marginalized and impoverished. Let me circle back to where we started. What do you do when you're outnumbered 40-1, when retreat means death and standing means probable death? Chard and Bromhead made their choice. They built a wall and they held it. For 12 hours, 140 men held a perimeter that should have collapsed in the first assault, against warriors fresh off the greatest victory in their military history. They held because they had no choice, because they had the right weapons, because they were disciplined enough to maintain fire under extreme pressure, and because the Zulu couldn't overcome the combination of rifle fire and fortifications without taking unsustainable casualties. This isn't a story about heroic British soldiers saving civilization from savages. It's a story about men trapped in an impossible situation, making second-by-second survival decisions in a war that was fundamentally unjust. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered. The Zulu lost hundreds of warriors for a meaningless raid. The British lost 17 men defending a supply depot in someone else's country. The Zulu kingdom lost its independence. The British gained a Pyrrhic victory that would haunt their military reputation for decades. Rorke's drift matters because it shows what humans can do when cornered. When there's no escape, no surrender, no hope of mercy, people find reserves of courage and endurance they didn't know existed. That's true whether you're a British soldier defending a mealie bag wall or a Zulu warrior charging into rifle fire for the 10th time knowing you'll probably die. Courage is universal. The battle itself, divorced from politics and empire, was an extraordinary feat of arms on both sides. The defense was tactically brilliant and required incredible discipline. The attacks required enormous bravery and cost the Zulu dearly. But we can't divorce it from politics and empire. This battle happened because the British invaded Zululand. The Zulu were defending their land. The British were enforcing imperial ambitions. The victory at Rorke's Drift didn't make the invasion just. It didn't validate British colonialism. It was a tactical victory in a strategic disaster, a propaganda win in a morally bankrupt war. The story of Rorke's Drift endures because it speaks to something primal. The last stand, the desperate defense. The impossible victory. We love these stories because they tell us that courage matters, that determination can overcome terrible odds, that a small group of committed people can hold against the world. And sometimes, rarely, that's even true. Rorke's Drift was one of those rare times. 140 men held a position that should have fallen, killed their enemies by the hundreds, and survived to tell the tale. But every one of those British survivors knew how close they'd come to annihilation. Every man who stood on that barricade at midnight, January 22nd, 1879, watching the flames from the burning hospital cast shadows on masses of Zulu warriors preparing another assault, knew he was probably going to die in the next hour. They didn't die, they held. And that's why we're still talking about it nearly 150 years later. History has few ironies sharper than this. The Zulu achieved their greatest victory at Isandlwana, and it meant nothing. The British suffered their worst defeat, and it barely mattered. Because at Rorke's Drift, on the same day, 140 men held a mission station and turned a catastrophe into a propaganda triumph that allowed the war to continue. If Rorke's Drift had fallen, if those 140 men had been massacred along with the 1,400 at Isandlwana, British public opinion might have forced a negotiated settlement. The war might have ended differently. The Zulu kingdom might have survived in some form, but Rorke's Drift held. The British had their heroic story, the war continued, and the Zulu kingdom was destroyed. That's the real legacy of Rorke's Drift, not just the courage of the defenders, though that was real, not just the bravery of the Zulu, though that was undeniable, but the way a single defensive victory can change the narrative of an entire war, turn defeat into determination, and ensure that imperial ambitions continue despite catastrophic setbacks. The men who died at Rorke's Drift, both British and Zulu, died for something larger than themselves. The British died believing they were defending civilization. The Zulu died defending their kingdom. Both beliefs were sincere, both were tragic, because this war should never have happened. Sechoyo didn't want it. The Zulu people didn't need it. The British created it for imperial reasons that look indefensible in hindsight. And yet, within that unjust war, individual acts of courage and sacrifice occurred that transcend the politics. Private Hook dragging patients through holes in burning walls while fighting hand-to-hand with Zulu warriors. Zulu regiments charging rifle fire repeatedly despite seeing their comrades cut down. Chard reorganizing the defense under fire. Bromhead holding the line when it seemed impossible. These actions matter. They reveal something essential about human nature under extreme stress. We are capable of extraordinary courage, extraordinary cruelty, extraordinary endurance, all in the same battle, sometimes in the same hour. Rorke's Drift teaches us that tactics matter. Chard and Bromhead made the right decisions. They built fortifications, contracted the perimeter when necessary, maintained ammunition supply, and kept their men fighting when exhaustion and terror should have broken them. Those decisions saved lives. It teaches us that technology matters. The Martini Henry rifle was the difference between survival and annihilation. Without that firepower, without the ability to kill at range, no amount of courage would have saved the garrison. And it teaches us that context matters. You can admire the defense of Rorke's Drift without celebrating the war that caused it. You can honor the courage of the Zulu warriors without condoning the raid. You can acknowledge British tactical skill without defending British imperialism. History isn't simple. Rorke's Drift isn't simple. It's a story of courage and terror, of tactical brilliance and strategic folly, of individual heroism in the service of collective injustice. It's a story where both sides fought bravely, both sides suffered, and both sides lost something irreplaceable. The British lost their aura of invincibility. Isandlwana proved they could be beaten. Rorke's Drift proved they could prevail, but at the cost of revealing how close they'd come to disaster. The Zulu lost their kingdom. They won at Isandlwana, and it didn't matter. They lost at Rorke's Drift, and it cost them everything, not because of the tactical defeat, but because it gave the British the narrative they needed to continue the war to its bitter end. That's the truth of Rorke's Drift. Not the heroic myth, not the simple story of courage under fire, but the complex reality of men making impossible choices in an unjust war, fighting for their lives and their nations, achieving extraordinary things that would be remembered long after the reasons for the war were forgotten. If this story moved you, if you learned something about Rorke's Drift you didn't know before, if you understand the battle better now, the courage and the tragedy and the waste, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you want more stories like this, stories that don't flinch from complexity, that honor courage without celebrating empire, that tell you what actually happened and why it matters. Share this video if you think others should know this story. Subscribe if you want more history without the sugar coating. We are building something here, a community of people who want to understand the past as it actually was, not as we wish it had been. Rorke's drift happened. 140 men held against 4,000. 17 British soldiers died. Hundreds of Zulu warriors died. The defense succeeded. The raid failed. The war continued. The kingdom fell. That's history. No heroes, no villains, just people making choices with consequences they couldn't foresee, fighting battles they didn't choose, in wars that would shape the world. Thank you for watching. Remember this story. Remember the courage on both sides. Remember the cost. Remember that victory and defeat are complicated, that bravery exists in every culture, and that the stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present. Rorke's drift matters, not because it was glorious, but because it was real. And that's what we're here for. The real history, the hard history, the history that makes you think. See you in the next one.